Hi, Nicholas. How are you doing today?
Hi, Peyton. I'm very well. I'm very well.
Glad to hear that. So today I had some questions, just a little bit about your background and how you got interested in the vast array of topics that are connected to some of your ideas around selecting bodies by lot, using jury selection as a model for other forms of government bodies, or just sort of your broader ideas about economics and politics, and so maybe you can give us a little background today.
Yeah. So I'm very happy to. I wonder whether I kind of like this topic. Well, lots of people do find themselves terribly fascinating, but it's. I lived in the garage of in a little flat, which was a converted garage of a historian of Australia who was incredibly famous at the time. He's not, people under 40 wouldn't have heard of him now. His name is Manon Clark. And I wrote an essay about him because I was sort of trying to figure out what I thought about him. And lots of people did this in my generation. And I wrote about him, and I read this biography. I can even, here you go. How about that? Two biographies in my wardrobe, not my wardrobe, my bookshelf, and there's all these books. So anyway, I was quite interested in him, and even one about his marvelous wife. And as I wrote about him, I actually think that his kind of magnum opus, which again you can see there, there's 3 of 6 volumes of a history of Australia. I don't think it's very good, but it provided a platform on which he could kind of reflect about himself as a writer and a whole bunch of things like that. And he gave very good speeches, very inspiring and thoughtful speeches, quite rhetorical as well, but not in that sort of modern manipulative way. And he wrote 2 autobiographical books, and he was sort of doing it all to reflect on himself in a sense. And so as I've been sort of changing the way, as my vision, if you'll pardon how pompous the term is, as that has matured and grown, I've been really quite intrigued by where did this come from, and how did I arrive at it. And the sort of beginning of the story is basically that my brother and I both tried quite hard not to be economists. Our father was an economist, and that's what you do, and we both failed. His explanation for this is that economics is really so interesting. My explanation is kind of the opposite, that economics drives out so much of life and is so reductive that that's all you're left with, is this apparently tangible set of considerations. And anyway, I became, so I learned economics by the time I didn't know it at the time, but by the time I was 10, 12, 15, I understood economics because Dad would talk about it in the family, and it's not hard to get the hang of economics. You don't look directly at phenomena, you look for patterns, and you look for what economists call equilibrium. So if prices are going up, you don't care. If they're going down, you don't care. But if you can tell a story in which in equilibrium, when things settle down, those prices look like they'll be wrong, then that's something that an economist gets interested in. And that whole way of looking at the world is really pretty easy to learn. I can prove that because our best treasurer, Australia's best treasurer, is a guy called Paul Keating, who was very uneducated. He didn't go to uni. He didn't have a university degree. He didn't study economics, and he had a better understanding of economics than lots of the people who ended up advising him. And I found myself in a very similar situation when I happened into political staffing, that is working for politicians on their personal staff when I was in my mid-20s, and I started working for he was the shadow minister for in the Westminster system, the opposition and the government. He was the shadow minister for communications, and then I came back after they'd got into government, and he became the minister for industry. And I was involved in a very extensive reorganisation of car manufacturing in Australia. And what I found was that there was this incredibly polarised discussion, and on one side were the industry themselves asking for protection and so on. On the other side were economists saying they're all pressure groups, they're all trying to rip you off, what we need is free trade. And I basically sided with the economists, but gradually became more and more shocked that, and I never wavered from the idea that we absolutely had to reduce protection, but I was more and more shocked at the tribalism of this discussion and at the tribalism of both sides. And my father had brought me up to think of economics as pretty thoughtful, helpful discipline, and these economists weren't even listening to the industry. And of course, the industry understood the microeconomics of the industry better than the economists did, even though the industry was, you didn't want to do what the industry told you it wanted, which was to just make life easier for it. But the industry was the bunch of people who had the information. And so I kind of became fascinated by sort of talking to the industry and trying to figure out how to lower protection in Australia in a way that maximised the chances of ending up with a healthy industry. So it was a transitional problem. But nobody wanted to talk about that. They wanted to have this big fight between protectionists and free traders when the serious questions were, how do we get to free trade? Because if that's going to take us 10 years, that's a huge amount of assistance, and we don't want to just hand it out to quietly euthanize the industry. After having handed out all that assistance, we should be able to end up with a pretty healthy industry. So that was an introduction to the way in which economics was made was not a sort of a bunch of tools for solving problems. It was a tribal identity, and it didn't adapt itself to trying to work out what the problem was. Particularly, it adapted itself to, we're now familiar with the term culture war, and that was really what I was encountering. And of course, it didn't get that name for another 2 or 3 decades. And so I wanted to kind of defuse that wherever I could. And I acquired a technique for saying, yeah, all right, well, you want to get to free trade, good, fine. Let's assume I agree with you. Now, you agree, don't you, that we're going to have to do this gradually, so it'll be at least 10 years, yes. And you agree that that's a great deal of assistance to give an industry, yes. Well, then it matters what form this assistance takes. Can we please talk about that? And it was quite shocking how little attention was given to that topic. And that was a sort of a template for it's quite a good description of the way I go about my work, which is to kind of look for things that that seem important that people aren't focusing on, and to try also to develop a set of questions which are, and here's a cricketing analogy which will be troublesome for Americans. But in cricket, it's called a short rising ball, and the bowler comes in, and if he can bowl it in such a way that the ball rises up at the batsman's chest, the batsman can't really get out of the way, so the batsman is put to their mettle, put to the test of playing they have to play to defend, to survive. They can't not play the ball. And so I would develop this way of trying to corral the conversation into these questions that mattered rather than the questions that didn't matter. And so that's a very concrete description of the way I kind of went about my work. The other thing I would say is that the only education I ever got was in history, not in economics, because history is a very reflective discipline. It doesn't have a theory that anyone's trying to fit things into. You kind of make your theory up as you look at the as you look at the materials. And that led me, I was fascinated in the theory of history, in the question of reflecting on what you're doing as you're doing it. And I realized now that I took more and more of that into economics. And then as I looked around, hunted around, pursued what I've called my Jerry Seinfeld method of inquiry, which is walking around, looking around. You notice things that seem unusual, that seem like they will repay investigation and interest. You find something, an interesting way to put things, an interesting way to say, well, this is really that. And then you can often then work backwards. And when you work backwards, you say, well, that connects to that, that connects to that. By doing that, you can end up with quite powerful new ways to see things, which have very broad application. And we may talk later about, I think you've already mentioned this idea of sortition or political representation by sampling, that is by something like random selection rather than by elections. And I first just thought, well, wouldn't that be a better thing to do? And then working back, I think of all the people around that I know of who talks about the value of things like citizen juries in politics. I think I'm the only one that has turned this into I think of it as a kind of very deep idea with endless, you unpack this thing that there are two ways to represent the people via elections or via sampling. And then in each of these two worlds, everything is very different. If that makes sense. I know I've gone on a great deal now, but that's a big long response to your prompt.
Well, thank you very much for that. One question I have to take us back a little bit is when you're engaging in this kind of discourse where you're trying to bring people, use this term tribalism, the people of very different committed viewpoints to come to some sort of agreement or some sort of common policy or plan. How much of that involves, what might be called compromise? And of course, from this, there's this kind of management speak where you talk about these win-win or win-lose or lose-lose. I mean, how much is involved in, when you approach problems in this way, what kinds of outcomes can you reach? Are they always, let's say, these win-win outcomes, or are they frequently win-lose, or how would you characterize this? There's always a trade-off, in other words.
Yeah. Well, I think I wouldn't describe myself as a master of negotiation in any other than sort of rhetorical negotiation, if you like. This idea of getting people outside their comfort zone, not into a well, it is a kind of a discomfort zone, but it's not trying to upset anyone. It's just trying to get them to focus on how to solve a problem rather than whose side they're on. So the way, so my way of doing this would be to say to a meeting, and I was trying to do this. I was very young. I was 25 or so, and that's not a great way to have a room full of unionists and business people think you're serious kind of character. But I would my way of framing it, I think, was pretty on the money, in the sense that I would say, look, I don't want to talk about free trade or protection. The government has at least rhetorically said it wants to lower protection in the long term. Everyone here agrees that either we shouldn't lower protection immediately or we should do this gradually. And the ones who don't agree with that, it doesn't matter, because the politics of that will accept that the politics of that don't go anywhere. So we are all in this room agreed that the industry will have a lot of assistance, even if it phases down over time. So why don't we focus on the form that assistance takes? And once you've done that, then you are looking at win-wins in the sense that each side are getting, the free traders are getting what they want, and we've already been told by the government that it wants that. And then the industry and the unionists are getting more of what they want, which is a healthier industry at the same cost of assistance. But I think so it's not traditional negotiation. In fact, this is very interesting because what my brain always goes to, and this is, I guess, because I kind of always I sort of learnt how to think this way from an early age, is I'm always thinking, well, a hell of a lot of the time I'm thinking about public policy. What do we do as a whole, not what is in a particular person's interest. And yet a lot of if you pick up a book on negotiation, of course, that's not the frame. It's not saying what's better for both of us. It's saying how do you get the best out of a negotiation. But if I think about it, a friend of mine describes it as my betweenness. And when I think about it, but my instinct in any situation, it might be economic, it might be political, will be to say, all right, well, how much of this can we take as given and sort of slough off the tribalism part of it, and how can we use that as a platform to do stuff better? So let me. That's very abstract, and it's even not a very good. It's even not a very good description of what I'm talking about. So let me to try and be more specific. What I find myself doing a lot is I find myself saying, well, business should support business should, for instance, support decent policies against tax avoidance because it's in business's collective interest. And of course, then people say to me, well, you're just naive because businesses they're busily trying to wide out the system as much as they can for their own private benefit. To which I say, yes, that's absolutely right. And I'm not actually expecting business to be heroes here. I expect they'll continue to do that. All I want to address is businesses. I don't want to address any idea of them having a having some secret pocket of altruism, although that's also true. Most people do, if you can kind of address it in the right way. I'm just saying that businesses collectively have an interest in having systems of taxation that actually work and that are not completely undermined by tax avoidance. And so they can each go and try and maximize their own loopholes and get their industry association to weigh in on behalf of the integrity of the tax system. Now, I can't claim any huge success in this, but that's the way I always try and think about these things, and I get misunderstood because people think that I've kind of come up with this idea and I'm asking the wrong people. Because why would they do it? And the answer is, well, people have there are different aspects to people's interests, and there is a way to say, you together with others have a collective interest in this. I can give you an example if you like, but I've talked long enough, and you might want to ask me another question.
No, I think it'd be very interesting to hear the example.
So one of the things that drives me crazy is the shitty way in which universities rank themselves. And so what happens is that there's an excellent podcast on this by Malcolm Gladwell, by the way, and in the 80s or 90s, I mean, it's quite a shocking story, really. In the 80s or 90s, I think it was the 90s, US World Report was in commercial trouble, and they came up with a bunch of things to try and fight back against Newsweek and Time, I think it was. And someone said, why don't we publish some rankings for colleges and universities in the United States? So they bodged up a methodology, and they produced these rankings, and they're terrible rankings. And and the rest is history. These colleges fit in with these rankings and desperately try to please US World Report to get up the rankings. And so I was talking to someone about a proposal to build, because universities and academics now game this system, because there's ways to, universities are paying academics more for producing articles which turn up in high, I nearly said high net worth, in prestige journals. Everyone's in on this game. So I say, why don't we build some kind of data science, some sort of engine which goes about looking for the data signature of gaming the system. Examples would be a whole bunch of articles in usually in different journals with similar titles, which is called salami slicing, and you get some data and you use it to write 4 or 5 or 6 articles when really one would have been fine. They're not identical articles. You can't get sacked for doing that, and you get more brownie points for doing that. Well, there would be data signatures for that. There would be data signatures for p-hacking, which is essentially torturing the data until it confesses and gets you up to an arbitrary number that the journal articles say they will accept your article because it's taken to be statistically significant and so on. And then and the idea was, well, we can sell this back to the system. And so then I mentioned this to a few people and they say, well, good idea, but you can't sell it to universities because they're in on the racket. And the response to that, my short rising ball, if you like, is if you were a university and you are trying to game the system and you're appointing a whole bunch of academics, would you like to have this information or not? And the answer is, if you can pick somebody who's got good metrics and they're not gaming the system, you've still got an interest in picking that person, it seems to me, and maybe a bit of an altruistic. It doesn't cost you anything, basically. So that's a way, that's a way of drawing in individuals with a private interest and finding a way to address their collective interest in things working better, in them all playing on a better and more level playing field. And now, in fact, for the universities that are heavily exposed to gaming and know it, maybe they don't want to do that, and that's fine. But here, I mean, the end game in all this is that you end up with so much data and you're so influential that you can actually build much better systems of ranking. And at that stage, I guess the universities, the colleges that have been gaming the system most, or who are just winning out of how lazy and badly put together this stuff is, they start losing, and so they don't want to be part of that. But they still want to be part of your own private data. So that's a way to try to develop a public good or a public, after all, this is a bad, the existing standard is a bad public good, and this is an improved public good, and you're doing it out of competitive dynamics. Well, that's an exciting thing to do.
Yeah, that's a really interesting application of that idea. I mean, and it's interesting because I think if you look at this U.S. News and World Report rankings, I always wondered at some level why you needed this kind of thing in the first place. But it does seem to be something that people have really latched onto.
You don't need it. You don't need it. I mean, certainly Malcolm Gladwell, who's looked at it a bit more than me because I've looked at some of the other things, not the U.S. World Report stuff, but it's incredibly lazy. The methodology is incredibly lazy, and there's a huge amount of feedback in it, which basically means that if you've got a lot of name recognition, you stay up the top. So they ask all these college deans to rank all the other 200, 300, 5,000, whatever they are, all these other colleges 1 to 5, and it's kind of, they don't know. It's name recognition. Yeah. But And again, I think I've sort of done quite a lot of thinking about this regarding the internet as well, that, we knew about the race to the bottom of the brainstem, as Tristan Harris calls it, on Twitter and Facebook and so on. We knew that a decade ago, and I was in fact writing about a decade ago about apps that I call the middleware of democracy. And that would be a discussion app. I'll give you an example of this, because it was built by a friend of mine in Melbourne, which was a political discussion website. And what it did, he was a philosopher, and philosopher sort of turned consultant, small businessman. And the website was a discussion website, but what it would do is it would build metrics on people's participation in order to rank the quality of their participation. And the best, now I think he said there were 8 of these things, which he was unwise enough to call epistemic virtues, not my favourite term. But the one that's most easily, that makes, the one that explains what the hell this is a metric that tells you how well people's contributions are rated by those who disagree with them. Yeah. That's what we need. And it's a scandal, in my opinion, Peyton, a scandal. Think of all the institutions around the world that are not purely competitive private sector, but a sort of hybrid. Every university has some sense of that it's making some kind of contribution beyond its own bottom line. Every NGO, even, I would argue, large corporates, have an interest in developing, say, internally, this kind of technology. It's crickets, No, you just don't hear it. And this, it's not easy to make that commercially successful because it's immediate. It doesn't have an immediate commercial payoff. But imagine if that was taken on board as part of MIT's sense of itself, that it wants to run its debates internally. It wants at least people to have, at least there to be a module where people can turn this facility on and off and so on. It's very, and maybe it exists somewhere, but it seems to me this is the sort of, another one is in Australia, Great Britain, Canada, in all the Westminster English-speaking countries and in plenty of the European countries, there are state broadcasters. We have the ABC, Britain has the BBC. Now, they, particularly the BBC, is a big operation. It's got a lot of money. Australian government, the ABC, I think, spends about $1 billion a year. Now, it could be developing some of these kinds of tools, and they could federate it into schools. I didn't even, I mentioned universities, but imagine doing this. We've got debating competitions, which are pretty silly as far as I can see. There are so many ways that this, the world is just groaning for this, like a starving, like a person about to die of thirst in the desert looking for an oasis. This is the way people can see this problem. And these institutions who have a role, could play a role. They're just no one's home.
I wonder how, the idea of putting it inside of a business or a corporation is really interesting to me. But I wonder how much that would be, in a sense, undermined by, other forms of influence within the organization besides.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. So it kind of came to mind the example of Apple. So the way Apple's organized in a very overly simplified form is that you have a bunch of VPs who report directly to the CEO, and each person is sort of in charge of a kind of. There's sort of there are parts that are organized by, I guess, product, but also by by, for example, there's a team that makes the cameras that go into the iPhones and things like this. And each one of those VPs really oversees their organization. It's pretty independent from each other. But the way in which you have to act in order to get things done as one of these managers is to collaborate with some of the other VPs in the company and create. And if you can't do that, then you're not going to be very successful in the organization large. So I wonder if something like that could be created at, let's say, a peer level within an organization, and maybe I wonder how stratified something like that would need to be. So if you have people in a, let's say, something like let's say the BBC had a platform like this, where you would expect to some degree there to be some, obviously the average viewer or reader or listener would be involved in communicating on this platform, but I would expect also the journalists to be involved there too. So I wonder how that influence would be managed by a platform like this, or if there's anything that could be said about that under your kind of...
Well, I think there is. So I've done quite a bit of thinking about this, because I'm not sure whether it began with this thing, but it certainly got a big shot in the arm. In 2010, no, it wasn't. I think it was 2009, I was asked to chair something in Australia called the Government 2.0 Task Force, which was an inquiry that the federal government put on. And the question really was, back in those days, it was called Web. It was a very trendy new term called Web 2. Rather better description, I thought, was collaborative web. And the idea was Web 1 was a sort of hub and spoke thing. You could, an airline company could sell tickets online. And Web 2 was this way in which platforms connected people up to collaborate. And so I headed about 15 people writing a report to government about what does this mean for government. At the time, of course, people were in love with the internet's hyperconnectivity, and the community had just written an encyclopedia for itself, which was certainly shocking and exciting news for everyone. And you had open source software, and people were saying, in fact, it was quite funny, you can look this up, the New Zealand government police force sort of put on a bit of a hoax. They said they were writing the new Police Act on a wiki. Now, they weren't writing it on a wiki. They were doing some consultation over the net, basically. But this got them into the New York Times and all this sort of stuff. And everyone was saying, oh, well, this is all, everything's going to migrate to the web and it's going to solve all these problems like it did with Wikipedia. We need a Wikipedia of government and all this stuff. And as I thought about this, I kind of... it seemed to me that the way to explain why it hadn't happened, the reason it hadn't happened for government, and it had only happened in a few places and might not happen in many more, was that these were places where a social system could nevertheless travel quite securely towards better and better outcomes. So with open source software, you have the technical performance of the software, and if it doesn't meet it, you don't use the new patch. And with Wikipedia, reasonable people and the preponderance of people can agree on the neutral point of view. So they can't agree on whether George W. Bush was a good president or not. Hint for viewers and listeners, he wasn't. But they can agree on what school he went to, when he was born, when he was elected, and so on. So what you're looking at here is this proposition. I'll say, okay. So this is the difference between the world of is, or what I call the universe of is, versus the multiverse of ought. So politics is about the way the world ought to be, in some kind of necessary sense. Everyone's saying, well, we should invade Iraq, we shouldn't invade Iraq, we should pay more money to people who are unemployed, and so on and so forth. And that isn't that's not a unitary universe. That's a multiverse. That's lots of people have lots of views, and there's no way in which the best answer wins. So that's point one, and that's a very big point. The second point to note is that in all our oogling at the democracy involved in Wikipedia and open source software and peer production, we're just congenital sentimentalists about democracy, and we love how egalitarian these things are. But the egalitarianism doesn't count for nothing. Ain't count for nothing. I meant double negative there rather badly. It accounts for nothing without this selection mechanism. So you can only open it up if you've got this nice, simple, efficient system of meritocracy, of picking good stuff over bad stuff. And if you look at how Wikipedia or open source software works, well, most projects have got benevolent dictators for life, and they're extremely hierarchical. The Q, Jordan Peterson, and the lobsters, I guess. It isn't the case that there's nothing logical about having a benevolent dictator for life, although it's a very significant empirical fact. But there is something logical about having a hierarchy of merit for each idea. Each paragraph you could put in there about George Bush, if someone comes up with another one, you have to be able to say this paragraph with this word in it is better than that paragraph, or vice versa. And that's utterly, profoundly the most important thing. And then you can have it open or closed, and or different degrees, and there will be costs and benefits of the choices that you make. But you're whistling Dixie without that process. So that then leads us to say about ought questions, well, we're very weak in this area of now you'll never be able to say there is a single ought that we'll all agree on, and it's pretty unhealthy to be aiming for that. But surely what is incredibly important, I think, is to build this back end to have a mechanism, and that's really what parliaments are and what juries are, to have a mechanism for saying in a jury, I believe him and I don't believe her, or vice versa. And in a parliament, no, we're going to cut the unemployment benefit for one reason or another. And in fact, I didn't get all the coding done, and I was really I sort of sketched out an app which I called Fix My Budget. And that's an app which is a Wikipedia of government in a sense, because anyone who's got a proposal to raise revenue or save money on the budget would go to the website and they would say, here's what we should do. And in the back end, you would have retired Treasury officials and any volunteer who made their way up the ranks in the way that you do in Wikipedia or open source software. You would then develop this shadow bureaucracy that could tell you the truth, that could provide analytical power, but you need that. You need the ought layer. You need the merit layer. And we don't want to even talk about the merit layer. We just like to be sentimental about democracy. So it's incredible to me how little I don't know. You feel free to tell me I'm blowing some smoke up my own ass, but don't you think that makes sense? And if so, isn't it terrible that how little, or maybe you think that people are talking like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see things the same way, and it's interesting too, because at that merit layer, there's also the sense of which you have to let's say, suffer the consequences, both good or bad, of making the wrong or right decision, right? You have skin in the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyone can go on Twitter and sort of rile people up, and
Yes.
at the end of the day, it doesn't matter to them
Yeah.
because they're just someone posting from on their computer. But yeah, when you actually have to execute on this policy, I think it makes a big difference in terms of you're thinking about it.
Mm.
So that's an interesting aspect to it as well. And this idea too of kind of responsibility for your role or your actions, it does speak to what you were talking about earlier to some degree, when you're, let's say, going back to that time in your life when you were working on this the kind of reorganization of the auto industry. In some ways, when you approach the problem by talking, okay, we all agree that we're going to have this increased competition. We're going to also have this support for the industry as we move to this goal. You sort of take out the kind of contentious issues, the really controversial issues that people can speak to in a way without consequences because they're sort of decided already, right? So if I say,
yes,
it'd be like, I really think that America should have 100 people on the Supreme Court. Well, if I really want to make that argument, that's fine. Maybe some people will like it, but it's never going to happen. So it doesn't matter what I say about it. Right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
That's an interesting element of it as well.
I mean, I guess I was just thinking the hardest argument of all, it just occurred to me, the hardest argument of all is something like abortion, and it's not something that I really particularly like discussing. But the sort of thing I would do is I would try, and that I think is kind of axiomatically valuable, even there, but certainly in other areas, is I would get anti-abortion and pro-abortion on-demand people, and I would try to get the pro-abortion on-demand people to identify the most egregious circumstances where they would feel most uncomfortable about allowing an abortion, and I would ask the other side to do exactly the same thing. If a girl is raped, and now lots of people who are in favour of who think abortion is wrong will think that if you're raped, it isn't wrong, and some of them won't, and that's fine. I'm not really trying to tell you they're extremist or anything. But there's value even there in trying to get two sides who profoundly disagree with each other to at least come up with some kind of consensual process of drawing the boundaries around the disagreement. That's a healthy thing. It's actually, as I was explaining it, it reminded me of a method that John Maynard Keynes used in World War II. So John Maynard Keynes was the most unusual economic bureaucrat the world has ever seen in World War II because he had no position. He had no official position at the British Treasury, but he was asked to come in and to occupy a small office as a consultant, and everything went through Maynard. And Maynard basically had this brand new theory of how to make an economy zing, make an economy that was deeply depressed start ticking over. He was using the same theory to make an economy that was now zinging because it was at overcapacity, producing bombs and planes and so on, to minimise inflation. Anyway, they would come to Maynard with, all kinds of questions. And, this is not a brilliant thing that he did, but it's sort of amazing that this kind of adaptive intelligence is so rare. Or it isn't. It's not that rare, but we don't teach it and we don't reward it. But they said to Maynard, well, we can't work out whether it was a question like, we can't work out whether to bomb Hamburg or the Ruhr. Just a question like that. And he'd sort of probed them for what they knew about these different scenarios. The answer is they didn't know much. They didn't know much about the chances of each. They couldn't calibrate anything much. So he basically said, well, here's a method for you. work out the I've just got to work. It's just a linguistic thing. He said, work out the smallest number that plausibly represents the maximum amount of damage you can do, and the largest number that represents the minimal amount of damage that you would expect to do. And then you can do the same thing with probabilities, and you can do it with economic damage and population terror or whatever it is and then you draw a line in the middle. And that's the best you can do. And they thought, yep, that's great, and they did that a lot. So this is adapting. You're trying to be as evidence-based as you can, knowing that you really don't have much evidence. But you are creating this very, very parsimonious kind of mental budgeting structure that gives you some structure. And this is sort of what I'm saying about how you run a debate between groups of people who don't agree with each other. All right, well, why don't you get together and work out the perimeters around, the perimeters of where the discussion starts to get less unequivocal on either side. And you can do this in lots of areas. I mean, normally it's not nearly as bad as abortion and in, protection and all this kind of stuff. You can say, well, we now provide 100 cents in the dollar protection in Australia in 1984. For every dollar spent assembling a small car from Japanese components, we'll give the assembler a dollar for every dollar they spend. And we give them nothing for exporting a car that they've wholly manufactured in Australia. Well, that doesn't make any sense, does it, gentlemen? Because they were all gentlemen. No, it doesn't. So let's all agree that we'll take some of this protection and put it over here. And on you go. So it is a sort of a negotiating process, but it's always about a public decision. It's not something which, but it has some private implications, and at some stage, there are private consequences, and at that point, the company might arc up. And I can tell you a story you might appreciate. About Toyota. It's a funny story. I really liked talking to Toyota particularly, and we became quite fond of the Japanese companies, particularly Toyota, and rather less fond of the American companies. But in the end, because the Japanese company, Toyota, was mainly in an assembly job, doing assembly from foreign components, because they were newer and those were the incentives for them. The way we tweaked the arrangements was to give quite a lot more assistance to full manufacture, to the manufacture of actual things in Australia, rather than this kind of pretend scheme that the Japanese have got themselves caught up with. And in the process of this 1 year of consulting and sort of planning and so on, I became very friendly with Mr. Tamura from Toyota, who occupied a strange position. He wasn't the CEO, but he seemed to have far more power and influence. He was one of there may be a name for this in Japan. I think he's one of these people who's beyond his, he may not have been being paid. He's a kind of an emeritus sort of position, but he had a huge amount of influence. He was much more important than the CEO. And he was extremely Japanese. And people said he'd been a samurai not a samurai. Yes, that he came from samurai background, and he'd been Saved by the Bell in World War II because he was lining up to be a kamikaze pilot, all kinds of, I don't know whether any of this is true. He had heavily gold teeth and he looked like a baddie out of James Bond, and he had this very Japanese way of speaking. And so my boss, John Button, said to him, well, Mr. Tamura, we've listened to everything you've said. You've been very helpful to us, and we've come up with this plan. And we knew that they weren't going to like it very much. So what do you think of the plan? And so Mr. Tamura went like this with his exaggerated, for Western sensibilities, his exaggerated pauses. He said, well, Minister, here is very good. Here is disaster. We are here. And that was his answer. It was lovely. Anyway, that was, basically Toyota just said, look, the key to this is whatever you do it for 15 years. Don't do it for 15 months, because these cars take a long time to plan and build and all this sort of stuff. So anyway, it was a nice little episode. I can't hear your sound.
Sorry about that. I've
That's
been
right.
muting it because of this.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Anyway, I think this is a good place for us to pause our conversation. So thank you very much, and we will talk again soon.
We'll send you the recording.
All right. Have a good
See
one.
you. Okay, bye.
Bye.